is with grateful hearts that we gather here today to celebrate Veterans Day. I want to begin today by recognizing all of those among us who have been a part of the great brotherhood and sisterhood we call the U.S. military. Military men and women know the risks, but they accept them. They accept them in many cases so others won't have to. Our veterans, active duty service members, guardsmen, and reservists, it is your service and sacrifice that has kept our country safe and free. They never gave up on us, and we can't give up on them.
To all our veterans here today, and to the veterans across America, whether you served in the beaches of Europe, in the jungles of Asia, the deserts of the Middle East, whether you served here at home or overseas, in wartime or in peace, whether you served proudly in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, or Coast Guard, you are part of an unbroken chain of patriots who have served this country with honor through the life of our nation. Carved into the marble behind me are the names of those dear to us that gave their lives for their country. We honor their service, as well as generations of heroes who made the ultimate sacrifice for our nation. And today, we gather to salute every patriot who has ever proudly worn the uniform of the United States of America. The resolution of the Congress, which first proclaimed Armistice Day, described November 11th, 1918 as the most destructive, the most sanguinary, and far-reaching war in the history of human annals. That resolution expressed the hope that the First World War would be, in truth, the war to end all wars. It is suggested that the men and women who had died, that they had not given their lives in vain. What has always made America great, what has made us exceptional, are the patriots who generation after generation dedicate themselves to building a nation that is stronger, freer, a little more perfect on this day and every day. We call this a holiday, but for many veterans, it's another day of memories that drive them to live their lives each day as best they possibly can. For our troops, it's another day in harm's way. For their families, it's another day to feel the absence of a loved one and the concern for their safety. For our wounded warriors, it is another day of slow and arduous recovery. And in national cemeteries around the country, it's another day where grief remains fresh. In a world tormented by tension and the possibilities of conflict, we meet in quiet commemoration of an historic day of peace. In an age that threatens the survival of freedom, we join together to honor those who made our freedom possible. Today we say, thank you, veterans. May God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.
By the dawn's early light, what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight of the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in there, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave? Oh, the land of the free and the home of the brave.
So suicide in general has been a national issue for a period of time in our country. It has been growing yearly, and it's becoming more of in people's consciousness that this is an issue. We know that for the general population, this is including veterans, about 45,000 Americans died of suicide in 2017. Approximately every year, about 1 million people make a suicide attempt. So when we speak about veteran suicides, we know that veterans have a higher rate of suicide than our civilian population. We know that, based on the most recent data, approximately 17 veterans die of suicide per day. I would like you to not focus on that number, but rather what we've learned about that number specifically is that 2/3 of veterans that die of suicide out of that number do not come to the VA for treatment. That means either veterans are not eligible, they're not coming in, and so even though the VA has a suicide prevention program and we're making a lot of effort to try to reduce suicide, we can't really get that number down if we don't all work together. And that's why I'm so happy to be here today, so that we can show you certain things to identify a veteran who's in crisis so we can get that veteran the help that they need. One thing I've learned from all my times of serving at the VA is that veterans are wonderful at supporting one another. I've never seen another group of people who help one another like veterans do. And so you all have this opportunity now to hopefully have some more skills in order to try to identify any veterans in your community that might be struggling so we can get them the treatment that they need. Even if it's not at the VA, but in the private sector as well. And that's something that the VA is doing, is that we are partnering with people in the community so that we can get this word out and we can work as a team, as a whole country, to try to really reduce veteran suicide. When we look at the data, there's certain groups of veterans that are coming up a little bit more concerning as of late. So that's our veterans in the age group of 18 to 34, young men. So that group is growing at a higher rate than some other veteran groups. Our female veterans are actually growing at a higher rate as well. And so we're definitely trying to target our female veterans more so because they have a significantly higher chance of suicide than the civilian counterparts at their same age. Another vulnerable group that we've noticed that has really spiked with suicide is the veterans that just get out of the service. So if you know any veterans that just got discharged from the service, there's a huge increase in risk in that first 12 months when they get out. We know that when they go from military life to civilian life, that's a very difficult time of adjusting. And we do see a spike at that time. So one thing that the VA is doing, that even if a veteran doesn't meet criteria for the VA, we are offering mental health treatment, free mental health treatment during that first 12-month period of time to make sure we can provide that support that that veteran might need during that transition. Another thing that we've noticed within our data recently is that about 70% of our veterans who die of suicide use a firearm. The general population, to give you a comparison, is about 50% of suicides are by firearms. We've talked to veterans, we've asked them, do you feel like we should have a conversation about this? So we can try to help our veterans who are in crisis if there's firearms in their home. And they said, yeah, 80% said, we really think you should have this conversation. We know that when people use a firearm in a suicide attempt, there's about an 85 to 90% fatality rate. If somebody uses any other means, it's a 5% fatality rate. The thing to remember is most people who make a suicide attempt, about 85 to 90%, never go on to die by suicide. That's really good chances that we can get people out of that crisis safely and they can do really well. But the folks who have a firearm unlocked and loaded puts them in a very vulnerable situation. And then we never have that opportunity to help those folks. We also know that within the research that most people make a decision to make a suicide attempt within an hour, sometimes within 5 minutes. And so it's a lot of times it's a very short period of time. The thing I can't stress enough is people are in crisis, it's a short-term crisis. It's a very short time people are feeling in that kind of anguish. And so we just want to get people safely through that short-term crisis so that we can get them the help and the treatment and the resources that they need. And we all can work together with that. The good news is suicide is absolutely preventable. There's so many things that we can do. And part of that is to just secure somebody's weapon in their home while they're in crisis, anybody in the home. We know that helping a veteran in that time of crisis is something that we all can do. And we can do that with little things. It doesn't necessarily have to be with mental health. It can be reaching out to another veteran, telling them, hey, how are you doing? I was thinking about you. That connectedness to another veteran can really go a long way. It doesn't have to be a big intervention. So all of us here have the power to do something to try to reduce veteran suicide. So now I'm going to get a little bit more technical, and we're going to talk about what we can do, some actual tools I can provide for all of you so that you can help us reduce veteran suicide. So at the VA, we like acronyms, and the Department of Defense as well. So we're going to talk about Operation SAVE. SAVE stands for S for suicidal thinking. We're going to talk about that. A is for ask the question being, are you having thoughts of suicide or having thoughts about death? V is to validate the veteran's experience. I can't stress this enough, that people feel this way for very real reasons. We don't want to minimize those reasons. And then E is to encourage treatment and expedite care. We know that if we get people in for care, we can help them with whatever their crisis is. We can really actually save a life and help these folks live the full life that they deserve. So first we're going to talk about risk factors. So what would be some risk factors that would make anybody maybe start having thoughts of suicide? This might be somebody who doesn't have mental health history, and then things happen and they start developing these thoughts of suicide. So it can be a lot of things. Some things that could be, for risk factors would be things such as like major losses. So that might be a loss of a loved one. That could be the cause of death. That could be a divorce. That could also be separation. A lot of us in this audience probably was separated from family and friends that you had no problems with because of COVID, and you couldn't have that connection that you normally do, and it feels terrible when we couldn't have that connection. And that lack of connectedness to people that we care about can really put us in a tailspin. Another loss to think about would be a loss of employment. So you lose your job. And then what happens when you lose your job? A lot of times you can lose finances, you can lose employment or housing. You can have the snowball effect when you lose your employment. When I started working at the VA, I started in 2008. And what happened in 2008? The recession hit, right? And so here I am, first time working at the VA, and I see this time and time again, these veterans who've never used this before, never had to, but now they lost their health care because they lost their job. They used all their money now to pay for their rent or what have you. Now they're in the situation where their housing was going to be lost. And these are just devastating. These are people who probably never had these thoughts cross their mind, and now they're struggling with these thoughts. Another risk factor would be mental health. It could be something like depression or bipolar disorder. When these things are treated, people do very, very well. But a lot of times people go untreated. And with that being said, when it's untreated, or even if it is treated and the treatment's just not effective, people can really start having these thoughts of suicide. So PTSD as well. We have folks who struggle with those symptoms, and it can create a lot of disruption in people's lives, and that can develop into thoughts of suicide. So those are certain things that would be risk factors. Legal issues, somebody having thoughts of legal issues can be definitely, that can be put people in a bind. I had a veteran who actually was a young vet. He was an Iraqi veteran. He got in some kind of bar brawl or something of that nature. He was a young guy, and he thought for sure he was going to get charged with a felony. He was so overwhelmed by this, was not connected with the VA at the time, just came back from Iraq, that he made a really serious suicide attempt. Somehow the private sector hospital called me, and I got him into the VA, got him registered, and we got him into veterans court. If you all don't know about that, there's a court specially for veterans so that it's not punitive, so it's therapeutic, and we can get them in the care that they need. We got him the treatment that he needed, and he when he finally met me in person, he started crying because he was so thankful. But here at that point in time, he could not problem solve out of that crisis that he was going to have this felony. He would never work again. He would never have a life, and it was just devastating to him. When people like him are in crisis, their ability to problem solve is really, really impaired. So when we hear of somebody who died of suicide, we say, well, why didn't they try that? Or why did they do that? Or why didn't they think of their family members? And the reality is people can't think really clearly during that kind of time of crisis. And so it is really helpful to try to get folks into care knowing that that might be difficult for them to see these other opportunities for help. Another one that people don't necessarily think about is somebody who made a history of a suicide attempt in the past. Sometimes people say suicide is an easy way out. Well, actually, suicide is very difficult to do. Us as a human race wouldn't survive very well if that was an easy thing to do. So there's a part of our brain that protects us so that we can survive as a species and as an individual. And so if somebody has the capacity to override that part of their brain, then next time if they are in a crisis, they might do something more lethal. And so anybody who makes a suicide attempt in the past is actually, that's their highest risk factor. Another thing that people don't necessarily think about is that lack of social connectedness. So I mentioned that a little bit earlier, just trying to stay connected. Doesn't seem like a big deal, but it really is a big deal. We know that people who do not have that social connectedness, they're not part of a group, that can actually really be devastating to people. So if you know somebody who's maybe in crisis and they don't necessarily have a lot of family support or people that are around them, that might be somebody to pay closer attention to. So now we see that there's some risk factors for folks. What would be some red flags or signs, the S for SAVE, of suicidal thinking? So a lot of people struggle with these thoughts, they're just not telling you. And so there's different things to look for of somebody who might be in a crisis, like we kind of talked about just now, and what are some of those signs to look for that somebody might be at risk. So some things that are socially acceptable would be someone talking about feeling like a burden. I feel like a burden to my family and friends. I feel like people would be better off if I wasn't around. People feel very comfortable talking about feeling like a burden. I hear a lot of veterans I work with talk like that. Feeling like a burden is a risk factor in of itself, and when you hear people talking about that, that should be a red flag that goes off for you to say, maybe there's something more going on with this person. Another thing would be people who talk about feeling hopeless. So for example, you might have somebody who nothing's ever going to get better, I'm never going to meet anybody again, I'm never going to find another job. This kind of hopeless, this no future kind of talking. People do feel compelled to talk like that when they're in crisis. You'll hear those kind of statements. That's another red flag to pay attention to, that this person might be struggling, and you might want to ask that question, and we'll talk about it shortly. Other things that would be a red flag would be getting your affairs in order. So nothing wrong with getting your will in order, but if you know that person's going through a pretty significant crisis right now, a very significant life event just happened, and you see that they're going to the lawyer to get their affairs in order, that might be concerning. Seeing things on social media. I've seen things myself where you hear people put things on social media like, I'm just tired. I can't do this anymore. I'm just done. And it's not saying that they're suicidal, it's saying things kind of in code. Pay attention to those kinds of statements. If it makes your gut feel kind of funky, pay attention to your gut. Again, it's not socially acceptable for people to come straight out and say I'm suicidal, but people will say these things more indirectly, and those are the cues that I hope that you will take from this talk today. Another thing, we talk about that social connectedness is such a big deal, and that's why veterans are so wonderful when they help one another, because they're so connected. But a thing to think about is somebody who maybe is connected and they're isolating. So this person's going in crisis, and this is your buddy, and you're reaching out to them, and they're not returning your calls. Maybe you're like, oh, they need a little private time, and that might be the case. But if it continues and they're isolating and pushing away that social connections that they have, that's really making that person more vulnerable. So look for your buddies that are pushing away, that are isolating. One thing that's really important is people who are doing really high drastic things with risk-taking. And so, like I mentioned earlier, it's actually very difficult to take your own life. And so what people will do is sometimes do activities that are really, really dangerous. For example, we have veterans who will drive really erratically and fast speeds and do things that could possibly get them hurt and killed. We have, I had a veteran who was going into a neighborhood in Chicago that had a lot of gunshots going on at the time, hoping to get accidentally shot. We've had veterans provoke police officers to try to get suicide by cop so that somebody else shoots them, or getting in fights. We have a lot of veterans who will play with their firearms. And they'll practice with their firearms. We've had veterans who played Russian roulette and do really, really risky things with that. People sometimes have medications, but they'll overtake their medication. So, for example, someone who might be able not to sleep, they might take a significant amount of sleeping pills. And you might say, and this would be a question I would ask, were you trying to hurt yourself when you took all those sleeping pills? And they'd say, no, I just needed to sleep. And then I might say after that, did you know that that could kill you? And frequently the answer is yes, but I didn't care. So you'll see people who will do really risky behaviors. They might tell you they're not suicidal, but the behaviors they're doing, the risk-taking is very concerning. You also might see an increase in substance use. That kind of falls under the risk-taking piece. So with the substance use, maybe they like to drink, party a little bit, but you see it's getting excessive. You're seeing that it's getting to a dangerous place and it's making you concerned. So pay attention to that when those substances are gaining traction. These are more risk-taking behaviors. Other things you could notice for somebody who might be, who's in a crisis that might be having thoughts of suicide, might be a really drastic change in their mood. So, for example, they might be really irritable or really angry all the time and have a lot of rage. Maybe their moods are all over the place. They have a lot of anxiety. And the reality is, a lot of us deal with these same emotions, but you see that this is more extreme than how they normally are. Maybe they're an anxious person, but right now the anxiety is really even hard to watch them. So pay attention to that really drastic change in mood. And also a decrease in sleep. We know that there is a correlation between lack of sleep and suicide. Even if nothing else is going on with folks and they have really severe sleep issues, that can actually lead them into having thoughts of suicide. So somebody who's really struggling with their sleep pretty consistently. So these are some signs of suicidal thinking. These are certain things to maybe look for, because a lot of people aren't going to come out and tell you. And so it's important for you to kind of maybe look at these kind of covert signs that someone's really struggling. They just don't feel safe enough to talk about that they're having suicidal thoughts. So if you see somebody that's in a crisis, that's demonstrating some of these signs of suicidal thinking, I encourage you all to ask the question. The question being, are you having thoughts of suicide? Are you having thoughts of hurting yourself? Are you having thoughts of death? Are you having thoughts of killing yourself? We want you to ask it very directly, and I'm going to tell you straight out, it's going to be a really uncomfortable question. Still makes me kind of anxious, because the reality is if they say yes, what do we do with that, right? Like, there's just this huge Pandora's box that's just going to open up, and how do we manage that? But we want you to, even though you're going to be anxious, to ask it directly. We do not want you to ask it indirectly, which would be, you're not having thoughts of killing yourself, are you? The reason we don't want you to ask it in that way is because, one, it tells the veteran that you're looking for a no answer. That's because you're anxious, and you kind of want a no answer, because you're like, what am I going to do if he says yes? Then next, it's also kind of judgy. I just kind of told you that my biggest concern that veterans tell me, if I tell anybody, they're going to think I'm crazy. And so the last thing that somebody's going to do is tell you the truth if they feel you're judging them. So just come out and say it very directly. So we have a veteran that's having these signs that we just talked about, and you ask this question, are you having thoughts of suicide?
well, that just seems kind of weird, like you just kind of throw it out there. So I'm going to give you like a little tactic, a little way to make it seem a little bit more organic so the flow goes a little bit better. So what I would recommend is that you tell your person what you see. What are those red flags that we just talked about? And so I have my fake veteran, his name is Joe. Joe is your buddy. He's in your poker club. And Joe is going through a divorce. He's been with his wife for 21 years. And Joe is not coming to poker club anymore. And you reached out to Joe recently. Joe told you he's not sleeping. And he's drinking about a half a case of beer a night so he could try to go to sleep. And Joe likes to, have a few beers when you guys are out in poker, but not usually a half a case a night, and not every night. So that's kind of concerning. So you're saying all these things. And Joe, when you talk to him, Joe seemed really sad. Understandably, he's going through this divorce, right? So you're saying all these things, and you're kind of like, all right, this is, he's pushing away from all of us. He's drinking a lot more. He's not sleeping. He's not coming around. He seems really depressed, and he's going through a pretty significant loss in his life with this loss of his wife. So you can tell Joe what you see. Joe, I know that you and your wife are going through this divorce. Now, this is where I would encourage you to do the validation, that V, which is our next step. But during this time, acknowledge the pain Joe's in. Acknowledge the trauma that he's going through. Joe, I'm so sorry that you're going through this. I can't even imagine what this would be like. And you're just acknowledging his pain. That goes a long way, that empathy. It's just empathic statements, actually. And then, I know that you've not been coming out to poker club recently, and you tell me you've not been sleeping, and you had to drink quite a bit of beer just to sleep. And you just seem really depressed when I've been talking to you. I'm real worried. And then I would lead in with that question. You can even go as far as, you know what, Joe, sometimes when people go through divorce, they can get thoughts of suicide. Are you having any thoughts of suicide, Joe? Because that leeway in is very organic, it's supportive, and then hopefully Joe will feel comfortable enough and safe enough to tell you how he feels. The reason I normalize that to a lot of my vets is because I know a lot of vets are really concerned that people are going to think something's wrong with them. And every single time I tell them, you're not crazy, you're just going through a lot. Once you ask Joe that question, what do you do? Like, people say, well, what if Joe says yes? What do I say to Joe? My thing was, if Joe wants to talk, sometimes this might be the first time Joe can talk about these things. Feels safe and he just starts talking a lot. Just let Joe talk. If Joe doesn't want to talk, that's okay too. Just be with Joe. But I would encourage you to get Joe to care as soon as possible. So E would be expedite care and encourage treatment. So there's a lot of really good treatment out there. VA has a significant amount of treatment that we can get Joe into right away. So if you think Joe's really at risk and you think he needs to get into treatment right away, you can bring him to the VA. He doesn't need an appointment. He can be seen by a mental health provider with no appointment immediately, not just a clinician like myself. He can also be seen by a psychiatrist if that's needed. He can also be started on medications if that's needed. Now, a lot of our vets don't want meds, but some do. In the private sector, that can't happen. They might be able to see someone in an ER, but they're never going to see a psychiatrist right away, and they're never going to get meds right away, and they're going to have an appointment. And so with the VA, we've set it up so it's super, super easy to get a veteran in for treatment. That can be at Crown Point. A lot of folks here might go to Crown Point. They have a walk-in clinic there during business hours, and Jesse Brown and Hines and all our local VAs, you can walk in 24 hours a day and be seen. So we encourage you to bring in anybody that you're concerned about. If you don't feel like Joe's maybe on imminent risk, you can direct them to the local hospital. You can let them know about that he can come as a walk-in to any VA. If Joe doesn't want to come as a walk-in, that's okay too. They can set up an appointment, and he can do it on video if it's a little bit inconvenient for him to come in, so we can get him started right away. So there's lots of different options we have to get Joe assessed and get him the treatment that he needs. We also know that there's other programs like the Vet Centers, if you don't already know about that. Those are for combat veterans and veterans with a history of, that are survivors of military sexual trauma. We also have Rush Road Home in Chicago, which is through Rush Hospital, which also helps our veterans. We don't look at them as competitors, we look at them as partners. And again, if somebody doesn't want help with the care at the VA, that's okay too. We still can work with you to try to get you some services in the community. We really just want people to get into care. So the last thing I'd like to go through is the Veterans Crisis Line number. If y'all can pull out your phones and you put this number in if you don't already have it. If not, you can always grab one of our items on the table. It has the number as well.
but it's 1-800-273-8255, and then you press 1 for veterans. For all your civilians out there, it's the same phone number for civilians. It's the suicide prevention hotline for the country. And what the VA did was we partnered with that number, and we pressed 1 to get to the VA side for the veterans. It can be for all active duty military veterans and their families to call. It's 24 hours a day. They can text as well, instant message. Two things I want to stress is that it's a crisis line, not a suicide hotline like the regular civilian line. We want veterans to call before they're in crisis. And even if you never think you'll ever use the number, we encourage you to take it, because a veteran's going to turn to another veteran before they're going to ever talk to us. Two things that I also one other thing I want to mention is sometimes our veterans are nervous about calling because they think that the police will be called on them. I can tell you that majority of the time that is not the case. About 6 million calls have come through thus far since it started, and they've sent maybe about 184,000 the last I looked a couple weeks ago, rescues. The only time we do that is if a veteran requests it or a veteran says they will not stay safe. So we really encourage you to give out that number and be our first line of defense. So I thank you all for your time, and again, I thank you all for serving our country.
United States Army. Raised by Ray Sellers, Vietnam vet. United States Navy. Raised by Underguard member Clara Gonzalez. Next flag, raised by Honor Guard member Debbie Elderhurst, Space Force. Next, the United States Coast Guard, raised by Honor Guard member Fred Trump, who's also a Navy and a Coast Guard veteran. Next, the United States Air Force, raised by Air Force veteran and Honor Guard member Pete Matrinick. United States Marine Corps, raised by Army veteran and Honor Guard member Tony Rebelez. The next wreath is being laid by Lansing Junior Women's Club.
Let's bow our heads and ask for God's blessing. O gracious God, bring us your heavenly peace. Save us from violence and thoughts of hopelessness. In your mercy and goodness, we thank you for all veterans of past wars, all men and women who serve our country now. Grant our nation security and peace, and stretch forth your almighty arm to strengthen and protect all who serve and have served in the past in the armed forces of the United States. We support them, we keep them from all evil, O Lord, and keep them sound in body, mind, and spirit. And we thank them now as they have served our country with integrity and honor. To God be the glory. Amen.